Welcome everyone to part 2 of module 9, which is social psychology. Today we're going to be talking about is conformity and obedience. So the big thing we want to talk about here is just thinking a little bit about social influence. And this is really what we're going to be kind of talking about throughout this entire thing. So social influence is the ways people are affected by the real or imagined pressures of others. And this is really what pretty much everything we talk about in here is going to be focused on, is this idea of being influenced by the pressures of other people, whether those are real pressures or imagined pressures. There is what we would call like a continuum of social influence. You can see them at the bottom of the page there. So the continuum of social influence is the social influence, or just the idea that social influences vary in the degree of pressure they bring to bear on an individual. So there's varying degrees. And I'm sure this is something we've all experienced, right? There's times where, there's a small amount of kind of influence or pressure to do something, and other times it's very, very strong, right? And we can kind of think of that spectrum. What you're actually seeing on the bottom there is the kind of the differences where we've got yielding to influence versus resisting influence, right? And so we can kind of look at kind of these different places that we can be at different points in time or different situations when we're thinking about social influence, right? Going from obedience, where we're following and doing exactly what we're supposed to do, and defiance on the opposite side, where we are actively going against what we're being told to do or what the influence is of society. So one of the big ways that we see social influence is through norms. So norms are the understood rules for accepted and expected behavior. Okay, these are the things that we are just kind of naturally know to do. One thing that's really important about norms is that some of them are very explicit, but a lot of times these are things that after a while you don't even really realize you're doing, right? So one of the things we could talk about is the idea of socialization, which is basically the kind of concept that over time you learn the norms of your society and you internalize them. You make them part of who you are. So really simple examples of this that I can give you guys. One really simple example is eating with a fork or a spoon, right? This is something where if you went to like the cafeteria, for example, where you went out to eat and you were sitting there, and let's say you were at a place with like noodles, you were getting like mac and cheese or something like that. If someone sat down and just reached into the bowl with their hand and started eating with their hand, that would be something that would break the social norms, right? That would break American social norms. That would not be acceptable, right? And there'd be kind of all sorts of other things that we were doing. Now, when you think about this, right, and the way you can kind of think about a norm is, okay, is this something that, biologically makes sense, or is this something that I've learned, right? If you think about little kids, they eat with everything with their hands, right? And you have to teach them, right, over time, right? Parents teach their children to use a fork or a knife or whatever, right? And eventually you get to the point where, when you're in high school, you look at other people and you judge them if they're not eating correctly, right? So those are norms that they're influencing, right? There's these rules that we have that are accepted and expected for behavior in society, okay? Norms are really, really important because they do two really big things. One of the big ones is they make society run more smoothly. If people didn't follow norms, there would have to be like actual rules and laws to kind of govern all sorts of different things that we just don't have to govern, right? For like a really simple example is like standing in lines, right? If there was no norm for being in line, you would have to somehow have rules for lines, right? It's not like if you butt somebody in line at Walmart, police come and arrest you, right? It's just a norm. It's just something you are supposed to do that is expected and accepted behavior, right? So that's one big thing, is it helps society just run much more smoothly. Additionally, though, it also keeps the group together. So it also allows us to kind of see similarities within each other, have kind of common, obviously norms, but common ideas about what people are supposed to do and how they do those things. And that kind of keeps us together as a unit, as a group, which is very important. It is important to mention too, I'm using norms on like a really, really broad scale, thinking about like the United States as a whole, but there's obviously norms within that, right? There's different norms for living on the West Coast or the South or the Northeast or the Midwest, right? There's different norms for different racial communities, different religious communities, even differences in like, what neighborhood you grew up with, right? There's a lot of different variations, whether it's smaller groups or larger groups, even your friends, right? Your friends have norms that are different from other people. That gets us to what is called social contagion. So social contagion is basically just the general idea that behavior is contagious, right? One of our really good examples of this is what is called the chameleon effect. So the chameleon effect is unconsciously mimicking others automatically without thought or effort. So for example, if you guys are watching this right now and you just yawned recently, right? That's an example of the chameleon effect, right? You see somebody yawn and it makes you yawn. That's a really good example, right? And that's why people say yawning is contagious, right? That's the chameleon effect. On the right here, you can see an example of a study they did. So basically the idea of they had a confederate, which is the term we use for someone who's like, you don't necessarily know that this is their part of the study, but they're like on your side, right? So the confederate would rub their face or shake their foot, and what we see is the participant follows them basically. If the confederate is rubbing their face a whole lot, they're going to rub their face more. If the confederate is shaking their foot a lot, they're going to shake their foot more, right? So again, we're seeing behavior be mimicked. And they also talked about doing interviews afterwards, and people didn't even necessarily notice that this was happening, right? They wouldn't necessarily realize what was going on. Continuing this idea of social contagion, we also know that this goes beyond just kind of specific behaviors, but can also go into emotions. So emotions are also contagious, right? But in general, emotions and behaviors can be contagious or mimicked unconsciously, right? And again, we kind of already talked about that. We'll look at this example of social contagion in class, but it's just basically extending that concept, right? So it's not just the fact that, we see somebody yawn and we also yawn, but it's also, when we see someone smiling and laughing, it makes us more likely to smile and laugh. When we see someone sad, it makes us feel sad, right? Emotions are also contagious as well. That gets us to conformity. So conformity is adjusting our behavior and thinking towards group norms. So again, we have these norms that are set up. Where'd I go? We have our norms that are set up, and they're there, right? When we're when we're exhibiting conformity, right? That is where we are adjusting ourselves to get closer to those norms. Okay. A really simple example of this that I think I can give is with style or clothing. Right. So one thing that I always notice as a teacher, and if you pay attention to it, you'll notice it as well, is groups of students, like friends, right? There will over time, right, mimic each other's styles, mimic the way each other talk, mimic the things that each other do, right? They start to kind of conform towards a group. So for example, if one of your groups of friends is like kind of fashion forward and they kind of pick up like a new style, right? Whatever it is. When I was in high school, like it was like skinny jeans were just coming out and that was the thing. Now obviously it's changing, again to other things. But if you have someone in your group who starts to do that, right, what you'll notice is over time, more and more people in the group will start to conform towards that norm. Right? So we'll see these kind of this shifting, right? So conformity, again, is adjusting our behavior, adjusting our thinking towards a group norm, whatever that group norm is. And again, this is why if you wander around, when we're actually all back in school, maybe next year, and you're looking at at the cafeteria, look around at the students that are sitting together. What you'll notice is a lot of them will look very similar. They'll have similar haircuts, they'll have similar styles of dress, they'll be wearing similar clothing, they'll be talking similarly. Because we naturally seek to conform to our group. One thing that's important to know too about conformity is it does not require the physical presence of others. So you won't necessarily just conform when you're with your friends, if that makes sense, right? It might be a little bit stronger, but you also tend to conform outside of that. So it's not like kids only dress a certain way. I mean, some maybe do. But it's not like you only dress a certain way when you know you're going to be with your friends, right? You might also dress that way even when you're not going to see them, right? And you can do that based on public knowledge, right? On the understanding of what public opinion is or what your group opinion is, and will still conform towards that group without even necessarily having to be there or having them see us or anything like that. That gets us to the research of Solomon Asch. Solomon Asch had a really important study that he did that's kind of connected to conformity. So basically what he did was he carried out the study, and what it was supposed to look at was how people's beliefs are affected by the beliefs of others. Pretty simple experiment. Basically what it was is they would show two lines, right? So or two sets of lines. So they'd have one that was like this, where there's like A, B, C, D, D, or A, B, C, D, E, and there would be, different lengths of lines. And then they would show another line, okay, and they'd kind of be separated a little bit. Then what they would do is you can kind of see there's this line of guys over here. This is the actual study. They would basically start at the beginning, and they would ask each person which letter of the line matches, this other line. Okay, so which one is the same? Now, what they did was only one of the people in the study is actually being studied. Everybody else is a part of the experiment. So it would start off and it'd be pretty normal, but eventually what they would do is they would have everybody in the group, except for the person who's part of the study, answer incorrectly and answer the same answer. So for example, in this one, right, every single person would say A. And what they were looking at was, would the actual person being studied change their answer to match the groups, right? And what they actually found is that a third of the time the answer was yes. A third of the time in this exact study, right, they would agree with the group even if it was plainly clear that the group was incorrect, right? And so again, we're seeing this idea of conformity and how we will conform our beliefs to fit the beliefs of others or of the group as a whole. That's going to get us to what is called normative influence. So normative influence is, and these are all kind of still connected to conformity, it's more about explaining why, right? So normative influence is one of the ways we can explain why do we conform. And basically what it is an influence that we receive from this kind of desire to gain approval or avoid disapproval. So I'm going to agree with the group because I want the group to like me or I want them to see me in a positive way. Or I know if I don't agree with the group, there's going to be negative consequences, right? I don't want them to be disapproving. I don't want them to look at me negatively, right? That's normative influence. So it's, again, we're influenced by this kind of desire for approval or to try and avoid disapproval, right? We're basically doing it because we want other people to like us and approve of us. Now, this comes, or this is kind of created by things that we see, right? We know things about when people don't fit norms, right? So what that's called is when you're not fitting social norms, is you're being deviant, right? That's pretty much what it means in general. So when you're not following those norms. And what we know is that individuals who are deviant often experience being disliked, being rejected, being ridiculed, or maybe even just being completely dismissed, right? Like they're just not a part of the group anymore. So again, there's kind of a strong influence. This normative influence can be really strong because the consequences can be really drastic if we don't conform, at least on certain things or far enough on certain topics. We also, though, have what is called informational influence. So informational influence is a little bit different. And instead of kind of changing an opinion to fit in, basically, right, to be liked or to be not be disliked, what informational influence is basically kind of our willingness to accept other people's opinions as reality. So one way we can see this is actually through things like movies, and you can see them like on reviews for products. So, for example, we've got ones where every single person gives something 5 stars or every single person gets something 1 star. Right, we tend to see these really drastic kind of shifts in those scores. But I'm sure all of you have experienced it too, where maybe you go and you see a movie and you're just kind of like, it's okay, right? It's not great. And then you talk to someone who really likes it, right? And they kind of like talk you into it being better than you think it was. And then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, it was pretty good, I guess, right? Where, again, we kind of have this willingness to accept somebody else's opinion about reality. Right now, again, we're not necessarily doing this because of the disapproval or approval of that, right? We're just almost kind of like accepting that other reality, right? Somebody else's reality. So next piece to talk about here is what is called obedience. So obedience is changing one's behavior at the direct command of an authority figure. So there's somebody who has social power. That's all an authority figure is. So obviously that can come with, things like a job or a position. But it can also be a whole bunch of other things, right? Your parents have authority. Teachers have authority. Friends that you think are cool have authority. All of these different things. It's just someone with social power. Okay. So anytime when we're talking about obedience, it's changing a behavior at the command of that authority figure, of that person with social power. Okay. Now, again, one thing that's important about it is obedience. There is a direct command. When we talk about norms and normative influence and conformity, this isn't something where you necessarily have to, right? Like you don't have to actually have someone come out and tell you you have to do this, right? Obedience, though, is direct. There's a direct command there. Authority is something we can see. So there's actually a lot of symbols that we use for authority, right? So things like titles, Mr., Mrs., Doctor, Sir, right? All those kind of different things are titles that we can give people with authority. Uniforms, so obviously things like police officers, for example, have uniforms that very specifically tell us they have authority. Badges, we can also see those on police officers. Perceived success can also be something that signifies authority. So someone being really wealthy can signify authority. There's all sorts of kind of different pieces here, right? And we can talk about the different symbolism because it's everywhere, right? Another really simple example is at school, right? So generally speaking, when you walk into a classroom, when you walk in there, a lot of teachers are going to be exhibiting certain symbols of authority, right? So when you walk into class, they're probably dressed a little bit nicer than all of the students, right? At least for the most part. They're probably wearing, if they're a guy, they're wearing dress pants and a collared shirt. If they're a girl, they're probably wearing, either something kind of similar or maybe a nicer dress. But they're just going to be showing kind of certain symbols that say, I am an authority figure in this context, right? So you can think about those different pieces. One really big example we saw of obedience came after World War II. So I'm just going to kind of read this whole piece and then I'll add a little bit to it. So it said prominent military and political leaders of the defeated Nazi Germany faced military tribunals in Nuremberg, Germany for their war crimes in 1945, right? The Holocaust, obviously. Many used the quote-unquote superior orders defense. So again, this is a legal trial against all of these different people, which is basically the idea that saying I was given an order and I had to obey it, right? Now, and again, this is maybe not necessarily as deep as you would want to get into it if you actually want to talk about this. But the idea here is that there's this kind of, we were given an order, I have to then obey the order, right? Now, interviews at the time, right, or at least some of the interviews that were given to these people afterwards, revealed that a lot of them were kind of quote-unquote what were considered ordinary, right? That they weren't necessarily all these kind of super crazy extreme people. They kind of were seemed like normal people. Now, again, this is obviously something that if you're a history person, you could argue against. But if we're using the context that we have, right, this would be an example of this kind of idea of obedience, right? That there is someone above me, that person gives me orders, right? I have to then carry those orders out. That gets us to Stanley Milgram. So Milgram has a really, really important experiment, probably one of the most important when it comes to obedience. And it's super, super famous as well when it comes to psychology in general. Basically, what he was trying to do was measure obedience, right? Now, there's a bunch of different ways that they've done this, but the general one you can see here on the left. So we have 3 people, okay? We have a person who's behind a wall, right? I guess it's really important. E and L are in on the experiment. T is the person we're actually experimenting on. So we have E, who is basically representing and again, we can change this, but in the traditional version, he is like the researcher, okay? So he's probably in a lab coat, he looks very official, he's a researcher, okay? T is our subject, they're coming in, and then we have L, who's behind a wall. You can't see L, but they're told he's behind a wall, and then he's hooked up to a machine. You can see the little cuffs on his hands, okay? What they basically had them do was they would give I believe it was like a spelling test, something like that. They were like spelling words or remembering words. And if they got it wrong, what they had to do, from the administrator's kind of coercion, the subject was supposed to give an electric shock to that person, right? And each time what happened is the shock got stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, there wasn't actually someone getting shocked. It was just, someone pretending they were. But they couldn't see them, obviously. Now, what the actual experiment was trying to see is how far would this person go, right? If the doctor continued to push them to give stronger and stronger and stronger shocks, and they kept hearing this other person on the other side eventually literally screaming in pain, how far would they go? Would they just continue to go based on this kind of obedience, right? Would they just continue to listen? That's really what the big thing is, and that's what they wanted to see. We'll watch this, the actual experiment here, so we'll actually watch an example of it here. This image right here on the right, I'm covering it up, hold on, is the actual results. So on the bottom here, we can see the different shocks, right? So we start with slight, we work our way up to the 3 X's, which is death, basically. This is where people are no longer responding, so they're getting more and more extreme. And then this bar is the percentage of participants that continue to obey, right? Now, one thing you should notice is that people continue to obey about a little over 60%, I think it's about 66 or 67%, would continue to obey all the way until the end. They went all the way until at some point, literally the guy is screaming and then he stops screaming, right? So the presumption is that that person literally might be dead. So they would continue that far. And again, what they're showing here is obedience. Now, there's a whole bunch of different examples. So obviously, there's kind of the initial experiment that we'll look at. But there's also a lot of variations, right? And you can kind of see those in this bottom section here. So what happens if we change, where the experiment is carried out? What if it's in an office building as opposed to a laboratory? What if it's at someone's house? What if it's in the experimenter isn't in the same room, right? So the experimenter is the E. Can I go back? The experimenter is the E here, right? So what if he's in a separate room as opposed to the same room? What happens if the victim is in the same room as the participant? What happens if the participant has to make physical contact? Maybe they shake hands before it starts and they meet each other. What happens if there's two people, right? So it's not just you by yourself. There's 2 confederates, right? So they changed all these different things, and then obviously you can see, right, different changes cause the different likelihoods of how far people would go, right? How likely you were to go all the way to the end. The big kind of pieces to pull out is that obedience is increased or goes up when the person giving orders is an authority figure and close by, right? So in our original experiment, right, they're like a doctor and they're right next to you. So when they're an authority figure, they're close by, you're going to be more likely to be obedient. If the authority figure is supported by a powerful institution, so if they're like, I'm a doctor from Harvard University, and we're studying this and this and this, or I work for the government, or I'm from the office of the president, right, that's going to make them, have more authority, make us more likely to be obedient. If the victim is depersonalized or separated, that also increases it. So if I don't meet them, I don't know their name, I never see them, that's going to make me more likely to be obedient. And also, if there were no models for defiance. So what that means is that I didn't see somebody defy, right? So I don't actively see someone else defy. So when we're talking about if there's 2 of us, if one person all of a sudden defies, right, that gives me a model for defiance as well, and I'm more likely to also defy. So again, all of these kind of different things are things that we know about, how likely it is that people will be obedient. So that's going to wrap up this section here. Take a few moments, again, write a short summary, about 4 or 5 sentences, and I will see you guys next time.